Today on the podcast, we are up to part 12 of the story of Disney artist Herb Ryman. And at this point, we're moving into topics that really aren't explored much with any depth in the major biographies about Walt Disney. The biographies about Walt during the war sections mostly focus on the Navy and Army training films, which were a key source of income for the studio. Without those training films, the studio might have faced bankruptcy. But there were other, far more interesting and unusual projects that the studio worked on during these same years, two of which involved Ryman to some extent. We'll talk about one of those projects in this episode, and next time we'll talk about the other, an unmade animated feature. Both of these projects are largely forgotten now, but they both define interesting ways that the Disney studio connected with the national war effort in the early part of the 1940s. So, if you're ready, let's go. Through spring and into summer of 1942, Ryman worked on films to promote unity between North, Central, and South America. With other Disney artists, he exhibited paintings from their South American trip at the Pasadena Art Museum. This was part of a larger cultural exhibit arranged by the coordinator of Inter-American Affairs, in which Chilean artists were invited to fill entire gallery rooms at the museum. The Disney team presented work ranging from quick sketches of landscapes and street scenes torn from their sketchbook to the finished production drawings for the films. To support the exhibition, Ryman was one of 3 Disney artists asked to give a lecture focused on their experiences down south. His was called Impressions of South America. These efforts, too, were designed to bridge cultural connections between North, Central, and South America, mixing American and Chilean art into a single show. During these months, Ryman and the other artists from the South American team continued to enjoy close friendships. Though Norm Ferguson had friends in nearly every department, his birthday party that year, held at his North Hollywood home, was filled almost entirely with friends from the trip: Chuck Wolcott, Ted Sears, Lee and Mary Blair, Jack Cutting, and of course, Herb Ryman. Part of the celebration was focused on dances such as the samba and the tango they had learned in Brazil. When Ryman wasn't focused on the South American pictures, he, along with dozens of Disney artists, developed films to prepare new recruits for the realities of military service. These training films, which eventually included topics for both the Navy and slightly later the Army, would be one central focus of the studio as America went to war. The early films for the Navy included a range of training topics: U.S. Navy landing signals, which for financial tracking purposes was given the production number 2616. Aircraft carrier mat approaches and landings, production 2617, and even protection against chemical warfare, production 2625. For the Army, Disney made both practical films, such as a series focused on the visual identification of aircraft, production 2615, so new recruits could quickly differentiate between Allied and Axis planes, and films that explored a philosophical justification for war, such as Know Your Enemy, Germany, production 2647. There was great pressure within the services of trying to get everything out, recalled producer Bill Anderson. The Navy wanted their thing given priority. The Army wanted their thing. Walt was getting calls almost daily. Can you handle this project? Can you do this for us? And Walt would always say, hell yes, we can do it for you. We'll find a way to do it. As a result, the studio became an official plant supporting the war effort, a company that also had clearance to review top-secret information essential for the films they made. Key advisors from the Navy and Army regularly visited the studio to review films in development, which changed the nature of the studio. It had once been imagined as a type of commercial arts colony, but now resembled something closer to a military base. Unlike films made for theatrical release, some training films used simplified animation in which cutouts of planes were moved centimeter by centimeter across a still background to create the illusion of movement. Others used still drawings or technical diagrams left on screen for 10 or even 20 seconds to illustrate a single point. Still others used actors to demonstrate or explain key concepts, such as how to quickly identify an American plane by looking at its key components: wings, engine, fuselage, and tail. When hand-drawn animation was employed in these training films, it was often basic, such as chunks of ice forming on the wing of a plane or a curved arrow showing the path a plane should take while landing. One artist recalled that those training films the studio made were the most boring thing in the world for an animator. It was all so technical and dry, and you had to be very precise. A typical theatergoer of that era would have difficulty recognizing these films as coming from the same studio that had created Fantasia and Mickey Mouse. Though Disney was financially dependent on the military, the Navy in particular, Walt pushed forward with some traditional fare. After 5 years in production, Bambi would be released to theaters in August. This would be the last traditional animated feature. That is, a feature focused on a single story that Walt would release in the 1940s. Walt also moved forward with cartoon shorts featuring well-known Disney characters, but even here the subject of the war influenced general release stories. Some shorts released in 1942 ignored the war entirely, such as Mickey's Birthday Party and Donald's Snow Fight. But others absorbed the cultural tones of 1942, such as Donald Gets Drafted and The Army Mascot featuring Pluto. Beyond this, Walt considered how other contemporary elements might be explored with animation. Back in the early to mid-1930s, Walt had relied on train travel for trips across the country. But for the past year, for the South American trip and for business trips to the East Coast, Walt had relied on air travel, logging tens of thousands of miles. As such, he was interested in creating a short comedic history of aviation, a humorous story from the Wright brothers to the present day, showcasing how quickly aircraft had evolved from mechanical novelties to sophisticated planes used for commercial transportation. As Pearl Harbor receded into the past, the anxiety felt by Disney employees receded as well. Some artists even joked about the possibility of another airstrike. Harry Title recalled the joke that stayed with him for years. Someone suggested that, in order to spare the enemy the embarrassment of missing a nearby aircraft plant, and incidentally to save our own hides, we paint a sign on our studio roof complete with the appropriate arrow. Lockheed 3 miles that way. No such sign, of course, was painted, but this proposal revealed that some artists were returning to their previous outlook when gags and comedies were at the center of their existence. The largest change at the studio, however, wouldn't come from the Navy or Army or even from fun-loving animators. It would arrive from an unlikely source, from a highly decorated Russian military pilot who, during the Marxist Revolution, immigrated to the United States, where he worked with the U.S. military and later oversaw his own aircraft company. His company developed extremely fast fighter planes for military use. His name was Major Alexander de Seversky. Trained as both a pilot and an engineer, Seversky's greatest gift was the ability to design highly effective aviation equipment arranged for military use. Though in the years leading up to World War II, he lost control of his aviation company, the Seversky Aircraft Company, he maintained a professional interest in how aircraft might transform modern warfare. In Seversky's view, traditional methods of land and sea warfare were no longer as effective as they were 20 years ago. England, he pointed out, once gained global superiority through its navy, but naval battleships were poorly configured to win a war in which attacks were likely to come from the sky. One only needed to look at losses at Pearl Harbor to see how relatively inexpensive, quick-moving aircraft had a tactical advantage over expensive and painfully slow battleships. After the air attack on Pearl Harbor, he said, our Navy was at the bottom of the ocean and our Army-controlled Air Force entirely inadequate for the task. Instead of focusing on surface combat with tanks and ships, he proposed that the United States develop a separate Air Force, independent of the Army and Navy, to focus on long-range aerial missions. These planes wouldn't be housed on battleships, but on the ground. They wouldn't provide ancillary assistance to ships and troops. Rather fly independent missions across continents or oceans to attack targets thousands of miles away. Ultimate planes, he explained, that will carry the war to the enemy direct from the shores of the United States. At times, he also pointed out that aerial warfare would also minimize American casualties in a global conflict, as the number of servicemen lost in a downed aircraft was minuscule compared to the number lost on a torpedoed battleship. For a while, he explained his ideas in articles and in lectures, but after Pearl Harbor, Seversky wrote a book in which he proposed that America could win the war by taking to the skies. The American aviation industry is so far ahead of its Axis counterpart this minute, he added, that we could tell the enemy everything we intend to do in the future in the designing of airplanes, and he could never catch up with us. His book, called Victory Through Air Power, was published during the third week of April 1942. The book was both an argument for the development of an independent American Air Force and a bitter critique of both the Army and Navy's failures at the start of the war. Materials promoting this book described naval ships, previously a strength center for the American military, as now just a bunch of sitting pigeons for superior air power. Despite its academic tone and framework, the book was a quick success. Within 4 weeks of its release, it began to show up on bestsellers lists. On May 25th, it appeared on lists in New York, Philadelphia, Washington, D.C., Baltimore, Cleveland, Detroit, Dallas, and San Francisco. There are multiple stories as to how a copy arrived in the hands of Walt Disney. One story suggests that an employee gave it to him, another that a copy was sent to him in advance of its release date. Regardless, sometime in either April or May, he read it and was captivated by its message. Seversky's argument likely appealed to Disney on multiple levels. First, for his entire life, Walt believed modern inventions had the potential to positively reshape the near future, and here Seversky's central argument was that aircraft, the technology of tomorrow, had the ability to overtake battleships, the technology of yesterday. Second, Walt was already interested in exploring through humorous animation, the history of aviation with an eye toward how quickly air technology had matured, which paired well with Seversky's ideas. Third, more so than Americans living on the East Coast, Walt, along with his artists, had lived under the ongoing threat of Japanese air power, a threat that presented aircraft as a more deadly and unpredictable element of force than ships or troops. Lastly, Walt understood that the artistic approach of the training films might be repurposed to create a theatrical film for a general audience with minimal expense, though such a film might have sections of full animation to illustrate some ideas. It might also use cutouts of planes moving across a background, a single drawing or diagram held on screen for many seconds, and live-action narrators using language to explain complex ideas. There would need to be a careful mix of comedy, drama, and exposition to create a film like this, Walt knew, but he also understood that the influence of a successful film was far greater than the influence of a book. Walt believed in the book's message, particularly that a greater reliance on aircraft had the ability to advance America's military goals and more quickly end the global war. He also understood that to produce such a film would be a difficult path to travel, particularly because Seversky imagined a world in which the role of the Navy and Army, both of which were funding the studio, would shrink to allow the Air Force to come into being. So I read the book, Walt explained, and I believed in air power. The thing that I felt just went right along with our century. I just felt, well, gee, if they're going to go out and try to use battleships and all those other things, I just didn't believe it would ever work. From the start, some animators were aware of Walt's interest in the topic. They also could see that if this went forward, it would change the nature of theatrical animation produced by the studio. Up until this point, the studio had roughly 3 standards of animation: extremely expensive animation, reserved for the features, which at times approached the level of art; a mid-level quality of animation focused on caricature, reserved for short cartoons; and lastly, a low level of animation used on the training films, which developed visuals only to the level necessary to clearly illustrate a point. A project like this had the potential to place the lowest quality of animation into a full-length feature, or at least into part of a full-length feature, even though features were typically reserved for the studio's best efforts. According to Seversky, Walt sent a telegraph to his New York representative to obtain his phone number. A few days later, Walt called Seversky's secretary, who, with a note of confusion, told the major, "There's a man on the phone who says he's Walt Disney, and he would like to discuss your book." And equally confused, Seversky took the phone and slowly learned that it was in fact the very Walt Disney who produced animation in California. He explained that he had read my book, and since it dealt with the future, he wanted to animate the events yet to come, which would lead to victory. Though Seversky was initially skeptical that a Disney film could advance a serious discussion about global military strategy, he became convinced that Disney, through animated sequences, could effectively illustrate his vision of the future for a large American audience. The human race, Seversky explained, unfortunately, is not able to visualize novelties, and this is where the Disney films come in. Indeed, the magic of the animated cartoon technique is such that the onlooker sees events of today and those to come more sharply, more comprehendingly than if he were present at the event in real time. Walt was aware that such a film was a risky financial venture, a film that, unlike Snow White or Pinocchio, would likely never make any money as a re-release, as public interest in it would be wholly tied to the war. Because of this, it needed to be produced economically. There might be some lovely animation, such as a humorous section focused on the history of aviation, but most of the film would either be live action or short animated sequences focused on the technology of warfare. Though the financial viability of this project remained a concern, the most serious problem related to the Army and the Navy's disdain for Seversky's ideas, as his proposal recast existing divisions of the military into support roles for a glorious new Air Force. Navy officers working with the Disney studio quickly learned of Walt's plan to create a film adaptation of Seversky's book, a plan that they hoped to undermine. "I was called into a kind of staff meeting," Walt Disney explained. "Officers said, 'Sit down, son. We hear you're going to do victory through air power.'" Walt admitted that he was. Then, with a manufactured tone of naivete, pretended not to understand how such a project that promoted an Allied victory over Germany and Japan would pose a problem to the Navy. "You know what that's going to do to our battleship program?" an officer asked. "I just want to tell the story of air power," Walt said. Then he explained that if battleships were central to this war, he was sure that would be highlighted in the press as well. Discussions didn't end with this meeting. The Navy asked one officer, key to the Disney film project, to work on Walt as a way of ensuring that federal funds went toward Navy equipment rather than toward some pie-in-the-sky Air Force. Tensions between Walt and the Navy were quickly noticed by studio employees. And this venture took no small amount of personal courage on Walt's part, Disney manager Harry Title observed, because at that time we were heavily into war work, and our largest customer was the U.S. Navy, with men stationed right there in the studio. Even Seversky understood the underlying problems. The book and the proposed film were highly controversial. As a result, there were threats that some Navy and Army documentaries he was doing for the military would be canceled. Initially, Walt explored the possibility of federal funding for the film project, as the film would also highlight national goals. But the government was unwilling to support it, presumably because it posed an ideological threat to both the Navy and the Army. Even when Walt understood that the studio would need to pay for the project by itself, he moved forward. "This was on my own," he said. "This wasn't subsidized." Walt himself was clear on his motivation. "I made it because I wanted to do it," he said. Tense meetings with the Navy continued on and off all summer. "They had very serious talks with me," Walt revealed. The Navy also increased their order for training films, though their rationale may not have been to support the studio, rather to overwork artists so Walt couldn't possibly focus on a feature. If so, this strategy proved ineffective, as Walt now had his mind set on making this feature. But conversations with the Navy did change Walt's ideas about the picture. Eventually, he conceded to some of the Navy's points, not about the importance of battleships or air carriers in the near future, rather that the tone of a military film made during wartime needed to cast the entire military in a positive light. Walt didn't want his film to lower national morale or reduce the public's confidence in current military plans. Most importantly, he didn't want a Disney film to suggest that young men stationed on current Navy ships might lose their lives needlessly. "I did agree," Walt explained, "that there was an interim period, that aircraft carriers were vital at that time until they could be replaced with something else." During these weeks, Walt walked a narrow path. On the one hand, he needed to continually assure the Navy and the Army that his film would only focus on the future benefits of air power, while on the other hand, he needed to convince Seversky that it was essential to remove key chapters of his book, namely those that criticized current military operations, for the version he would present on screen. More than once, Walt reminded Seversky that a Disney film needed to explore the positive elements of air power without focusing negative attention on other divisions of the military. "Remember," Walt said, "the Navy is convoying. They've had to put Navy convoys all up and down the coasts. The Navy is doing a marvelous job right now." At times, Seversky pushed back, attempting to add a few sentences that critique the Army or Navy leadership with the goal of elevating military strategy. "We're losing the Battle of the Atlantic," Seversky complained. Even to this, Walt explained that their film would not only explore air power, but also build national unity. "The narration will keep saying, 'Our Navy, our Navy,'" Walt insisted. "All through, the film will give the Navy a build-up." In some meetings, Seversky pointed out that vehicles made for surface warfare, including ships and tanks, were limited to two-dimensional movement, which made them easier to target, whereas planes moved in 3 dimensions. Walt, who by now had learned a few things about military equipment, often remarked that submarines also moved in 3 dimensions and, as such, were equally difficult to target. This was an observation that Seversky had introduced into their discussions weeks ago. But now Walt repeated it, which had the effect of demonstrating the usefulness of the Navy, even under the specifications of Seversky's own criteria. The sub, Walt said, is in effect like the airplane. Another time when Seversky suggested that a critique of current U.S. strategies might be important to highlight the benefit of air power, Walt replied, "Is it wise for us to let our enemy know how ill-equipped we are?" To this, Seversky did not have a good answer. Story meetings began over summer, largely to figure out how to arrange the 15-minute animated introduction, which explored with comedy the history of aviation. As Victory was a highly topical film tied to the current moment, Walt wanted to release it quickly, ideally by the end of the year. The key to a quick release was to move complex animation into production as soon as possible. So even as the Disney team planned out the more serious segments focused on Seversky's book, animators such as Ward Kimball would already be working on the animated sequence at the start of the film. Those speaking commitments and other engagements caused Seversky to leave the studio. He spent most of September with Walt, where they discussed how to effectively present his message on screen. The initial answer was to frame the movie as a press meeting in which Seversky explained his views on air power to 4 reporters. In terms of a production schedule, the overall goal was to complete a script as quickly as possible so that the film might be released within months. "We worked at his studio in Burbank," Seversky said, "in my bungalow at the Beverly Hills Hotel, sometimes in restaurants, sometimes while driving to and from the studio." The story team wanted to make sure that the audience immediately warmed to Seversky, a man with a thick East European accent, connections to Russia's vanquished aristocracy, and a starchy military personality. To do this, the film would begin as the Major introduced his loyal co-pilot, his dog, a Cocker Spaniel named Vodka. Vodka would walk onto the set and sit next to Seversky. "Here's a real flying dog," Seversky would say while petting Vodka on the head. "He's very air-minded." Once the reporters and the theater audience took in the dog, Seversky then would explain, concept by concept, his overall plan. One of the reporters was supportive of air power. Another believed that traditional troops and ships would win the war. Yet another wrote a column intended for female readers, including women with sons eligible for the draft. Seversky framed his main argument around a prudent use of resources. As the United States had limited finances, limited raw materials, and limited manpower, the country should prioritize resources towards those military efforts that would be most effective, which for him meant air power, even if there were benefits to other divisions of the country's military. Following this, he explained individual aspects of air power, short discussions followed by a section of animation or at times live action that illustrated his key points. The overall effect of the presentation, at least as it was then planned, was an illustrated lecture with Seversky narrating much of the film. The film would end with an animated section that depicted the eventual victory of Allied troops. Walt Seversky, along with a few story artists, refined concepts for the film section by section, mostly during the middle of September. One meeting focused on possible questions that reporters might pose to Seversky. Other meetings focused on the ways that aircraft was superior to surface and sea transportation during a war. Yet another explored how long-range planes might drop bombs on Tokyo, a moment that, at least for the California studio, would be a key element in ending the war. Disney was aware that this film was a significant and risky departure from previous efforts. It used the allure of entertainment to present a sophisticated military proposal to a general audience. It was part argument, part education, even part propaganda, mixed with the visual tones of a Disney short to create a feature. Walt, as a filmmaker, saw the project as part of his civic duty. Democracy's ability to survive, he said, depends on the ability of its individuals to appreciate their duties as citizens and to comprehend the complex problems of the changing world we live in. This film, he believed, would expose millions of Americans to the near-future possibilities of air power and persuade them that planes should play a larger role in the fight against Germany, Italy, and Japan. As this outline was being developed, with clear delineation between topics for dialogue and others for animation, Walt called a meeting with key studio artists in one of the third-floor screening rooms not far from Ryman's office to explain how this material would work as a Disney project. As Ryman recalled, roughly 100 people attended this presentation, with Walt and Seversky at the front of the room. Ryman sat near the front, not far from Walt. The meeting, as he remembered, started well. Walt talked with great enthusiasm because he was a terrific salesman, Ryman said. Then Seversky explained his ideas about long-range land-based bombing. Seversky, too, was confident and engaging. He was a charming guy, Ryman admitted. Seversky talked for about an hour, and once finished, Walt stepped to the front where he again explained that he had bought the screen rights for Victory Through Air Power and that he intended to adapt it for film. By this point, Ryman was beginning to grow concerned. He saw this as a training film, but one that was over an hour long. I was just horrified, he explained. I was aghast at what the film would be, a bunch of maps. It would be just like that animation, finished 7 years ago for the MGM film Mutiny on the Bounty, in which lines and arrows showed how ships moved across the ocean. As Walt discussed the project, his gaze repeatedly fell on Ryman, something that felt out of character. When Ryman looked at Walt, he often found that Walt's eyes were already focused on him. Walt looked right at me, he said, and no doubt in my face he saw consternation, amazement, disbelief, and fear. With this, Ryman had a hunch as to where this presentation would lead. I hope he hasn't invited me in here to participate in this film, he said, and yet I had a premonition that that was what was expected. Walt again outlined key segments, indicating how the animation would work so that everyone there had a clear understanding. That's what we're going to do, fellas, he said. Now we're going to begin. Though Ryman typically socialized after studio meetings, he walked somewhat dejectedly down to his office where he sat in his chair. For him, this project indicated that the features would now be subject to a lower quality of animation. Gone were the days of Bambi and Pinocchio, and Fantasia seemed like a memory from decades ago, even though the film was less than 2 years old. Walt followed me right after the meeting, he said. He saw me with my mouth open, and he stood there, and he took his hand and hit the side of the door jamb. This caused Herbie to look up at his boss, his friend. What do you think about the discussion? Walt asked. Ryman replied somewhat jokingly that Walt and Seversky had done all of the talking. There wasn't any discussion, he said. We didn't really say anything. Walt then appeared to understand the problem, that victory, though important, was another step away from art. "What's the matter, Herbie? Does it sound like a lousy idea?" In his mind, the only thing Ryman could see were maps, endless drawings like ones made for those terrible training films and for Mutiny on the Bounty all those years ago. All I could see, Ryman thought, was just a lot of arrows pointing and coming down with close-ups on the map, with some battle scenes or something. But he didn't tell Walt that. "Oh, no, wonderful idea," Ryman said. "Great idea." At this, Walt brightened. "Good," he said, stepping further into Ryman's office. "You're going to be the art director." Ryman understood exactly what this meant. He wasn't creating art so much as he was creating graphics. This was a few steps down from being an artist. Walt explained that Ryman would work with Ken Anderson on arranging all of these complex and at times confusing ideas into storyboard drawings depicting how key concepts would be explained visually on screen. He wanted them to begin right away because filming hopefully would start in just a few weeks. I'll be back next week with a new episode, and at least right now the plan is to post up our monthly news and analysis episode next Sunday, and it's been a completely crazy month for news. As you know, we're an ad-free, listener-supported podcast. We do just two things: deep dives on stories related to the history of the Disney studio and parks, and news and analysis of current events as they relate to the Disney company. We are funded entirely by listener contributions. You can support our efforts by becoming a monthly Bandcamp subscriber. On Bandcamp, you'll find over 200 episodes not available on iTunes. But the best reason to join is to support the work we do here and to make sure that this podcast continues to exist. You can become a monthly subscriber over at dhipodcast.bandcamp.com. I'll also leave a link down in the show notes. So until next time, this is Todd James Pierce.